There's a conversation that happens in almost every English learner's life. You're in a room, maybe a meeting, maybe a social situation, maybe just a casual moment with people who speak English fluently, and you have something to say. You know what you want to say. The idea is clear in your head, but the second you open your mouth, something happens. The words slow down, the confidence drops, and by the time you actually say anything, the moment has passed. And you spend the rest of that interaction slightly inside yourself, slightly disconnected, waiting for it to be over. I know that feeling. I lived in that feeling for a long time. And here's what nobody tells you about it. The problem was never really about vocabulary. It wasn't about grammar. It wasn't about accent or pronunciation, or any of the things that language courses spend most of their time on. The problem was something much deeper, much more personal, and honestly, much more interesting. Most people who are trying to improve their English are operating under an assumption that I think is quietly sabotaging them. The assumption is that fluency is a destination. That if you study enough, practice enough, take enough classes, download enough apps, eventually you'll arrive somewhere. You'll cross a line, and on the other side of that line, you'll be confident, articulate, and free. But I've talked to people who have been studying English for 10 years and still freeze when someone speaks too fast. And I've met people who have been in English-speaking environments for less than 2 years and move through conversations like they've been doing it their whole lives. And the difference between those two types of people is not how much they studied. It's something else entirely. It's a set of decisions, habits, and perspectives that most people never consciously make. That's what this video is about. Not tricks, not hacks, not a list of phrases to memorize. It's about the actual underlying things that separate people who build real, lasting English fluency. The kind that feels natural and free, from people who stay stuck at the same level no matter how hard they try. So let me start at the beginning. Let me tell you where I was before any of this made sense to me. I grew up in an environment where English was important, theoretically. It was on the curriculum. It was in the textbooks. Everyone acknowledged that it mattered. But the way we learned it had almost nothing to do with the way people actually use it. We conjugated verbs, we memorized rules, we translated sentences back and forth between languages. And at the end of every year, we passed the tests. And at the end of all those years, I could not hold a real conversation. I remember the first time I was in a genuine, unscripted conversation with a native English speaker. Not a classroom exercise, not a controlled situation. A real conversation with real pace, real idioms, real humor that I didn't quite understand, and real silences that I didn't know how to fill. I understood maybe 60% of what was being said. I responded in short, careful sentences. I smiled at moments I wasn't sure about. And when it was over, I felt exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with effort and everything to do with inadequacy. That feeling stayed with me. And for a while, my response to it was the same response most people have. I decided I needed to study more. More vocabulary, more grammar review, more formal practice. And for a while, that felt productive. It felt like progress. But when I went back into real conversations, I was still the same person I had been before. Maybe slightly more equipped, but not free, not natural, not confident. And it was around that point that I started asking a different question. Instead of asking, what do I still need to learn? I started asking, why isn't what I'm learning translating into the way I actually speak? That question led me somewhere uncomfortable, because the honest answer was this. I had been treating English like an academic subject when it needed to be treated like an identity. Here's the philosophy that changed everything for me. And it's the thread that runs through everything I'm going to share today. Fluency is not a skill. It's a state of being. Let me say that again, because it sounds simple, but it isn't. Fluency is not a skill. It's a state of being. Skills are things you practice in controlled environments and then deploy. A state of being is something you inhabit, something that moves with you, something that doesn't disappear when the environment changes or the stakes get higher. And you cannot study your way into a state of being. You have to build it. And the way you build it looks nothing like traditional language learning. It looks much more like personal development. It looks like the same process you go through when you're building confidence, or building discipline, or building any quality that you want to carry with you into every room you walk into. Everything I'm about to share operates under this idea, because every one of these things is ultimately about building a different relationship with the language, and more importantly, a different relationship with yourself inside the language.
The first thing I want to talk about is the decision to stop waiting until you're ready. Most people are waiting. They're waiting to feel more confident before they speak. They're waiting until their vocabulary is bigger. They're waiting until they don't make mistakes anymore. And the waiting feels logical. It feels like preparation. But what it actually is, and this is the uncomfortable truth, is avoidance dressed up as strategy. I spent a long time in that waiting room, and nothing in that room made me more ready. The only thing that made me more ready was going through the uncomfortable experience of actually speaking, imperfectly, nervously, with mistakes, and surviving it, and then doing it again and again, and discovering that the conversation didn't end, that people were more patient than I expected, that my mistakes were less catastrophic than I feared. The decision to start before you're ready is not a small decision. For a lot of people, it requires confronting a very real fear. The fear of being judged, the fear of sounding unintelligent, the fear of the version of yourself that speaks imperfectly. But here's what I learned. The longer you wait, the more weight you put on that first conversation. And the heavier it gets, the harder it becomes to start. The only way out is through.
The second thing, and this one changed me more than almost anything else, is learning to separate your intelligence from your English level. This is something nobody talks about, but almost every serious learner struggles with. When you speak in your native language, you are articulate, you are nuanced, you can make jokes, express complex ideas, handle disagreement, tell stories. You are fully yourself. And then you switch to English, and suddenly you sound like a completely different person. Simpler, smaller, less. And the brain starts to make a connection it should never make. It starts to equate sounds less impressive in English with is less impressive. And once that connection gets made, every conversation becomes about more than communication. It becomes about proving something, about managing how you're perceived. And that pressure, that invisible, constant pressure, is what makes fluency impossible. The shift happens when you genuinely internalize the idea that your English level is a snapshot of where you are in a process. It says nothing about your intelligence. It says nothing about your depth. It says nothing about who you are. It's just a current limitation that is actively changing. And operating with that clarity, not as a mantra, but as an actual belief, frees up enormous amounts of mental space that were previously being used on self-monitoring and self-judgment.
The third thing is about input, but probably not in the way you're expecting. The conventional advice about input is to consume more English, watch more shows, listen to more podcasts, read more articles. And that's true. But the type of input matters enormously, and most people get this wrong. They consume English content that they passively understand, content that doesn't stretch them, content that's comfortable, and comfortable input produces very little growth. What actually builds fluency is compelling input, content that you are genuinely interested in, that challenges you slightly beyond your current level, and that you engage with actively rather than passively. The word compelling is important here, because your brain absorbs language dramatically more effectively when it's emotionally engaged. When you actually care about what you're watching or reading or listening to, the language inside it gets attached to meaning and feeling.
in a way that vocabulary lists and grammar drills simply cannot replicate. I started consuming English content that I would have sought out in any language. Long-form interviews with people I found fascinating, documentaries about topics I genuinely cared about, podcasts that challenged my thinking. Not because I was studying, because I was interested. And the language came with it, almost as a side effect.
The fourth thing is output, and specifically the practice of speaking to yourself. I know how this sounds, but stay with me. One of the biggest asymmetries in language learning is that people spend enormous amounts of time on input and almost no time on output, especially the kind of output where the real internal work happens. When you narrate your day to yourself in English, when you describe what you're doing, what you're thinking about, what you're planning, you start to notice the gaps. Not the gaps that a teacher points out, the gaps that you personally experience. The moments where you reach for a word and it isn't there. The sentences that start clearly and fall apart in the middle. And those gaps, the ones you discover yourself, are the exact things you're motivated to fill, because they came from your own experience. They're yours. I drove to work narrating my drive in English for months. I took showers and described my thoughts in English. I sat alone at dinner and had quiet internal dialogues in English. And what I built, slowly, was a version of myself that existed in English. A voice that felt like mine. Not a translated voice. Not a performed voice. Mine.
The fifth thing is about identity. And this is where the self-improvement angle becomes impossible to ignore. Language is deeply tied to identity. The language you're most comfortable in is the language in which you are most yourself. And learning a new language, really learning it, not just accumulating vocabulary, requires on some level building a new facet of your identity. A version of you that exists in English, that thinks in English, that responds in English. Not because you've suppressed your native self, but because you've expanded. Most people resist this without realizing it. They keep themselves at a safe distance from the language. They use it as a tool, but never let it in. And that distance is exactly what keeps fluency just out of reach. The people who become truly fluent are the people who, consciously or not, allowed themselves to become someone inside the language. They made a version of themselves that lived there. And this is a decision you can make consciously. You can decide that the person you are in English is not a lesser version of you. They're an extension of you, a real one. And start treating every conversation in English not as a test, but as an opportunity to inhabit that person a little more fully. The sixth thing is about mistakes. And I want to reframe this in a way that actually changes how you relate to them. The standard advice about mistakes is don't be afraid to make them, which is fine advice that almost nobody actually integrates. Because the fear of mistakes isn't really about the mistake itself. It's about what you believe the mistake says about you. And telling someone not to be afraid of something doesn't address the belief underneath the fear. What actually changed things for me was when I started treating mistakes as data rather than verdicts. A mistake isn't evidence that you're not good enough. It's information about where the system currently breaks down. And the more specific your mistakes, the more useful the data. When I started listening to my own errors, not with shame, but with curiosity, asking, what does this mistake reveal about how I'm currently processing the language? My relationship to them changed completely. They became interesting. And interesting things are much easier to engage with than shameful ones. The seventh thing is about environment. And this one is probably the most underestimated factor in the entire conversation. Your environment speaks louder than your intentions. If your environment is not English, if the people around you, the content you consume, the spaces you move through are all in your native language, then your English practice is fighting against the default settings of your life. And default settings always win eventually. Not because you're weak, because that's how environments work.
Building an unfair advantage in English means engineering your environment deliberately. It means changing the default, setting your phone to English, following people who think and communicate in English, putting yourself in situations where English is the only option, even when it's uncomfortable. Not because immersion is magic, but because repeated, unavoidable exposure over time changes your brain in ways that scheduled practice simply cannot.
The eighth thing is patience, but a very specific kind of patience. Not passive patience, active patience. There's a period in language learning that I think of as the gray zone. You're past the beginning, you're not yet fluent. You understand more than you can produce. Your comprehension outruns your expression. And this zone is where most people either quit or stagnate, because the progress isn't visible anymore. It's happening underneath the surface, and there's nothing external to point to. The people who make it through the gray zone are the people who understand that this is exactly where the real development is happening. The invisible progress, the neural pathways being built, the patterns being internalized, the instincts being calibrated, is the most important work. And the only way to honor it is to keep going without needing immediate evidence that it's working.
The ninth thing is about finding your voice. Not just your English voice, but your actual voice, your perspective, your way of seeing things. Here is something I've noticed about people who become genuinely compelling in English. They're not just fluent, they have something to say. They have opinions, stories, frameworks, and ways of seeing the world that are worth listening to. And those things don't come from language learning. They come from a life lived thoughtfully, from reading, from reflecting, from genuinely engaging with the world and developing real perspectives on it. Your unfair advantage in English is not just linguistic, it's intellectual. The richer your inner life, the more you've read, thought, questioned, and experienced, the more you have to bring to a conversation. And the more you have to bring, the more motivated you are to communicate it. That motivation becomes fuel, and that fuel is sustainable in a way that external pressure and obligation simply are not.
The 10th thing is the one that ties everything together, and it's this: ownership. At some point, the people who become truly fluent in a language stop thinking of it as something they're learning and start thinking of it as something they own. It stops being a foreign language and starts being their language. One of their languages, a home they built and are allowed to live in. That shift from guest to owner changes everything about how you show up. Owners don't apologize for being in a space. They don't wait for permission to speak. They don't shrink when they make a mistake because they know the space still belongs to them. And they keep investing in it because you take care of what you own. English can be yours, not by birthright, by choice, by the accumulated decisions you make every day to show up, engage, practice, reflect, and keep building. That's the unfair advantage. Not a technique, not a shortcut. The decision to treat your English fluency as something that belongs to you and to act accordingly. Zoom out with me for a moment. What we've really been talking about this entire time is not English, not technically. We've been talking about agency, about the difference between moving through life as someone things happen to versus someone who makes deliberate choices about the person they're becoming. Every principle I shared today is ultimately about taking ownership of a process instead of being subject to it. Deciding to speak before you're ready is an act of agency. Separating your intelligence from your current limitations is an act of self-respect. Engineering your environment is an act of intentional design. Building your inner life is an investment in who you are, not just what you can do.
And here's what I think is the deeper truth underneath all of it. The reason fluency matters to so many people goes way beyond communication. It's about freedom. Freedom to move in more spaces. Freedom to connect with more people. Freedom to access more opportunities. Freedom to be more fully yourself in a world that is increasingly conducted in this one language.
And that freedom is available to you, not as a reward for passing a test, not as a gift that some people are born with, as the result of a series of choices made consistently over time with patience and with ownership. The people I've seen build real, lasting, confident English fluency all have something in common. It's not talent, it's not privilege, it's not even circumstance. It's the decision, made clearly and kept, to treat this as something worth building seriously, to treat themselves as someone capable of building it, and to stop waiting for external conditions to be perfect before they begin. That decision is available right now. Not next week, not when your vocabulary is bigger, not when you feel ready. Right now.
So here's what I want to leave you with. Fluency is not a destination. It's a state of being that you build through a series of deliberate choices about who you are, how you engage, and what you're willing to do when it's uncomfortable. The 10 things I shared today are not a checklist. They're a way of orienting yourself toward the language and toward yourself that changes the entire trajectory of where you end up. Stop waiting to be ready. Separate your worth from your current level. Consume content that genuinely moves you. Build a voice that speaks in the language. Treat your mistakes as data. Engineer your environment. Make it through the gray zone. Develop something real to say. And most importantly, take ownership. Decide that English belongs to you, and start acting like it does. If any of this resonated with you, if something I said today shifted something, even slightly, I want to know. Leave a comment. Tell me where you are in this process. Tell me what's been holding you back. I read every single comment, and I genuinely learn from what you share. If you found value here, subscribe. There's more where this came from. And every video I make is built around the same commitment to going deeper than the surface and being honest about what actually works. Thank you for being here. Now go build something that belongs to you.